Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Who should New Zealand fear the most? The United States, China, or Russia? Welcome, Robert.
That's Mario, Bruce.
We look at the big players on the world stage, our global role models, and sometimes it can seem that the options are a little bit dismal. Is it fair to call the United States system of government a corrupted form of democracy?
Certainly some critics have said that, and I think America is still a competitive and vibrant democracy, but, and it's a big but, I think that America's democracy, in the eyes of other democracies, at least, has degraded, particularly in the last 2 decades. There's been a long-term structural problem with America's democracy, and that is the prevalence of big money. It's very difficult, if you have modest means in the United States, to advance far in the political process. So there's a lot of big private money. Fundraising is a big preoccupation in American politics. So unless you're independently wealthy, or you're completely fixated with raising money, it's difficult to progress too far. And that's a shame, because there's a lot of talented people that are deprived of the opportunity to compete in that sort of system. And this is what, of course, politicians like Bernie Sanders have been railing against. I think the second thing is that, with respect to America, sees itself as a political exemplar for other countries. And I think that process has degraded, particularly since 9/11, the last 2 decades. I think many people look at some of the problems that America has, particularly in the areas of race relations, and also the fact that in its foreign policy it seems to be repeating the same mistakes that it's made. Take one area in counterterrorism. The United States has continued a policy of targeted killings of often very unpleasant people who are terrorists, but it doesn't seem to be working. And yet the Biden administration, which has recently eliminated the leader of ISIS, seems to be continuing in the same vein. And if we reflect on the last 2 decades, we can see that process is not working, because the terrorist groups have proliferated and extended their activities globally. So I think that's something that shakes the confidence of other democracies in the quality of America's leadership. And of course we saw that American democracy was deeply shaken by the insurrection which occurred on the 6th of January last year. So I think there is genuine competition amongst elites for power in the United States, and I think there's a deeply rooted commitment in the United States to norms and values of democracy. But I think in the practical workings of the United States government, there is a sense that the political system is broken and needs repairing in order to make that democracy, if you like, more vibrant and firmer, on firmer foundations.
So that's the United States. In name, China is a communist state and Russia is a democratic one. What's the reality for those two?
I think China could be interpreted or described as a state capitalist society which is masquerading as a communist state. Since the late 70s, China has very successfully, if you like, liberalized its economy. And in that period, China has dragged about 600 million Chinese out of poverty, an extraordinary achievement. So China has made spectacular progress, a huge society of 1.5 billion people, in, if you like, improving prosperity in that country. But nevertheless, that society has got an authoritarian system. There is quite profound corruption and also inequality. And in a sense, the inequality has been exacerbated as China's economic success has gathered momentum. Nevertheless, you could argue that the Chinese system seems to work for China, because who would have predicted back in the late 70s that China would be close in aggregate economic terms to overtaking the United States by about 2028. That's when the economists predict the Chinese economy will finally be bigger than the United States. So, in historical terms, that's a remarkable achievement in a relatively compressed period of time. With Russia, Russia is also an authoritarian state, capitalist society, but it does masquerade as a democracy. It has what might be described as simulated elections. So Mr. Putin pays lip service to democracy, but as we've seen, many of Mr. Putin's opponents or critics, whether they be in the media or in the political arena, find themselves seriously repressed, sometimes to the point of death. And the most competitive contender alongside Mr. Putin is someone like Alexei Navalny, who found himself, first of all, poisoned. He recovered, but returned to Russia after treatment in Germany, and then finds himself incarcerated on what many people see as trumped-up charges. So, I think Russia certainly has an authoritarian system, despite its claims that it's a democracy.
So which of these three should New Zealand most fear?
I don't think New Zealand should be scared or afraid of any of these states. I think we are much closer to the United States because of our respective democracies than the other two. But, all three countries face quite profound internal problems. And the other thing is, quite apart from the challenges, China has a deeply unattractive political system. Few countries in the international system are seeking to emulate what China's done. They like the prospect of trading with China, but that doesn't mean they want to, if you like, absorb the Chinese political system in the process. I think looking into the medium to long-term future in the 21st century for authoritarian regime is not particularly rosy. So I don't think in this context New Zealand should fear them. I think, compared with the United States, our democracy is in reasonable health. And I think compared with the problems that China and Russia face, we also, while there's no room for complacency, I think we've got a lot that we can be proud of here.
So how should New Zealand then behave on the world stage?
Well, if the picture I presented to you, Bruce, is accurate, that we do have three great powers who have quite serious problems facing them, we should also take into account these great powers may have pretensions or aspirations to run the world, but they actually can't. Why? Because most of the problems we face now don't respect borders, whether it be COVID-19, climate change, security, transnational terrorism, problems of the economy. These do not respect borders. We feel economic shocks all around the world. So, in a sense, I think, what is the role for New Zealand in this international transition that we're currently experiencing? I think the role is for New Zealand to stand firm on a rules-based international system, which the majority of countries support, and also on the norm of multilateralism. Multilateralism for the small and middle-sized states is a way of expanding their influence and power. So I think we should stand firm on that. And let's face it, for the reasons we've just gone through, most of the problems that we now face on this planet require international solutions. You can't solve COVID-19 other than at the global level, and that requires international cooperation. So I think New Zealand has a role to play, and I think in a sense it probably needs to take itself out of its comfort zone. We've always seen ourselves as a small country in the middle of nowhere or geographically isolated, which is not important. Whereas I think New Zealand's voice does carry more weight than it did in the past, and we can act as a bit of a playmaker on the international stage, bringing others together. And I think that's something that we can do constructively. And as I said, many of the issues facing us, whether it be in the Ukraine, whether it be climate change, whether it be transnational terrorism, require international solutions. And therefore, the small and the middle-sized powers have a role to play, and I think we shouldn't shy away from it.
You said that the United States is the best of the three, and that we are perhaps closest to the United States, but that there is problems with the system. Yeah. How do we avoid New Zealand becoming infected with the problems that the United States democracy has?
Most of the countries which are susceptible to these populist ideas that have circulated in the United States and polarized the United States have been facilitated by an electoral system where the winner takes all, sometimes called the first past the post system, which we used to have till the mid-90s. So I think our electoral process is more resilient. There's no doubt about it, Bruce. There are people within New Zealand who, in a sense, have similar political ideas to, if you like, some of the populists that we've seen in the United States supporting Mr. Trump, for example. And there are people here who believe that Mr. Trump has a lot to offer politically and they would like to see the New Zealand equivalents here. But I think they're relatively small numbers. For example, we're hearing a lot at the moment about the protesters outside Parliament against the restrictions introduced by COVID-19. But at the same time, nearly 97% of New Zealanders have moved towards vaccination. So, we have to keep this in proportion. And in a democracy, you do want divergence of view. You don't want absolute uniformity. So I don't think there's any room for complacency. We must be aware of the sort of disinformation and political manipulation that has gone on in societies such as the United States. But I do think, providing we protect our institutions and we continue to support those institutions, I think that we have a good chance of avoiding that sort of problem.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.